Mecca. We've got to talk about Mecca. If this book came from Mecca, folks, then obviously we must go back to Mecca to see if there was a Mecca. Wait till you see what we have found. Yeah, and this is something that Shoemaker brings up in page 96 of his book, this book here, Creating the Qur'an. He asks an amazing question. This is why I love this guy, because he's asking the question no one wants to answer, and that is, if this Qur'an was received between 610 and 622 in a place called Mecca, and then from 622 to 632 in a place called Medina, those are historical places. We're talking about a historical fact. Between 610 and 632, there needs to be a Mecca, there needs to be a Medina there in order for him to have received this Quran in those two cities, known as the Hijaz, the central part, very close to where you grew up and where you were born. You were born in Jeddah, not too far from Mecca, right?
That is correct.
So he goes back, he says, let's take a look. Could this book, the Quran, with all its sophistication, with all its enormous amount of theology, enormous amount of bibliology, because it's talking about biblical characters, it's talking about biblical places, it's talking about biblical events, it's talking about theological disputes, it's talking about even Christian disputes, enormous anti-Trinitarian versus Trinitarian disputes. Who is Jesus? Does he ever claim to be God? Does he deny his sonship? Does he deny his divinity? Does he deny the Trinity? These are, the Quran is full of these references, which suggest, therefore, there has to be Christians there in Mecca, Medina, for these discussions to have happened. There has to be Jews there to have even given the material on all these biblical characters, Abraham and Moses. Enormous stories about Abraham going into the Kaaba and destroying those idols in chapter 21 of the Quran. These are good stories. The difficulty is, or the supposition is, if all this material is there in the Quran, then there have to be Jews and Christians, there have to be people, there have to be thousands of people living in these. You brought up on one of your shows, and you do this, you brought up somebody, one of your, who was saying that at one point that there may have been anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 Jews in Yathrib. And Shoemaker, hearing something like that, would pull his hair out, because that's not what the scholars are finding. So what we need to do, and what Shoemaker does, and he goes back and he says, let's go look at these places to see if it could have accommodated this script, if it could have accommodated a Quran of this sophistication, hugely sophisticated. Because why? Much of the material is in an environment of debate, in an environment of exchange, in an environment of confrontation. If that is the case, then this should have been happening in Mecca, Medina, in the early 7th century, 610 up until 632, for Muhammad to have received this at that time and at that place. So when you go back on page 96, he says this. This is what's interesting. I'm just going to be quoting. This is Shoemaker stating this. He says, the near total invisibility of the Hijaz in any of our late ancient sources is seemingly a clear sign that it was isolated from the insignificant to the broader world of late antiquity. So he comes out with this right away. He says, we've got a problem here. There's just nothing there. Hawting, Gerald Hawting, who is my professor at School of Oriental and African Study, he was the one that really introduced me to this back in the we're talking about the last century, which shows my age. I was there in London, and I was going to school, and I did this course at the school at SOAS, and we did a whole year of just looking at the origins of Islam. And one of the first things he said when he was there in class, he said, I've spent 20 years learning the languages, archaic languages of the Levant and this part of the world to try to confront the Bible. After 20 years, I wasn't getting anywhere, but I already had the languages down. So I decided to turn my energies onto the Quran and ask the same question that had been asked of the Bible. Let's ask these questions of the Quran. This is the first day of class. He said this to all about 50 students who were in his class at that time. And he says, what you're going to hear for the next year is going to be a little unsettling. There were about 20 Muslims who were in the class at that time.
They all left, probably.
Within 2 weeks, all but one of them left. And when they left, they were slamming the door and yelling things that were not that pleasant at Dr. Hawting. But what was Hawting doing that was wrong? What was he doing?
He was just applying academic
historical criticism.
historical
He was
principles.
asking the same questions in 1994 and 1995 when I was there that Shoemaker is asking in 2022, which is the question everybody asks. And that is, if this book, the Quran, this one here, existed between 610 and 632 in the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, then it should fit the Hijaz in between 610 and 632, sorry. It should fit that environment. It should fit that place. It should fit those people. It should fit that time. So what did Hawting find out? Well, let's read what he said. He said, it turns out that the image of Mecca, which we find in so much modern scholarship, as well as in the early Islamic tradition, which both portrayed as a major pilgrimage center and a sanctuary, is nonetheless a scholarly mirage. That's what he calls it. This is just a mirage. There simply is no sufficient evidence, even from the late Islamic tradition, to support the existence of any pilgrimage to a place called Mecca prior to the rise of Islam. And so Mecca seems to have been incorporated into the Hijaz only sometime well after Muhammad's lifetime, most likely in the later 7th century. Oh dear, this is Hawting saying this. So he says this in two different books written there in 2018. So the question that Shoemaker asked, well, then could Mecca possibly be this Becca or Jerusalem or a Qibla or early mosque? Where did this Quran place Mecca? Many scholars are beginning to believe that the Becca of the Quran could very well be Jerusalem, where many of the mosques seem to be facing. Dan Gibson, you and I did a whole series on this. And Shoemaker's asking a very good point. Mel and I did a series looking at, with Paul Ellis. Paul Ellis has done a great work of looking at what we call the Jerusalem thesis. And he got back and he found out that Becca actually is well known. Becca is where the Jewish pilgrims, would stop before they went into Jerusalem. It was like the last stop to get rested before you go and do all your sacrifices there at the temple. Becca is very well known, but that's way up in Jerusalem, not a good 1,000 miles further south. That Becca is not only a Jewish thing, it is probably the word itself, Becca, is not the same roots as Mecca, as you well know since you know Arabic.
That's right. I mean, what a coincidence. You have Becca in the Bible, and you have Becca that exists today, the Beqa Valley, basically, or at least the Becca of the Bible in reference to a valley that people will cry on their way to Jerusalem. And somehow the Quran uses that word to represent Mecca, which is a geographical area that is way up north. What a coincidence.
What a coincidence, yeah. And this is why, if people are going to talk about where the Quran comes from, you need to ask the first question. If all the Islamic narratives, standard Islamic narratives, if all the traditions, if all the Muslims are giving lip service to Mecca, what are the scholars saying who actually studied Mecca? Now, probably the best one who studied Mecca is Patricia Corona herself. She wrote Hagarism in 1977. She wrote Meccan Trade in the Rise of Islam 10 years later in 1987. She is the only one that reads and writes the languages, 15 languages from that area, from that place. Therefore, she's the best qualified. I don't know of any Muslim that has done what she has done. And she has gone back, and this is her conclusion about Mecca. Let me just read her conclusion. This is from the Meccan Trade in the Rise of Islam, page 134 to 137. She says this: by all measures, the central Hijaz is that central area where Mecca and Medina are, and especially Mecca, appear to have been culturally isolated, except perhaps for the quite hypothetically possibility of some long-distance traders who might have interacted with Romans near the desert frontier. When she says desert frontier, you're talking about way farther north. The Romans did not come further down than Tabuk, possibly to Khaybar, but that's way up at the Gulf of Aqaba, way up in the north. That's where the Neom project is going to be is being built. It is highly significant, she continues. One should note that no source prior to the Quran makes any mention of Mecca, and the Quran itself mentioned it only a single time, and that's in chapter 48, verse 24. As we well know, the Quran that mentions it, probably even that verse is not a verse that was added into the Quran until possibly the 8th century. By the 8th century, then, yes, Mecca would have been well known, but not at the time of Muhammad, not at 570 when he was supposedly born there, not in 610 when he started receiving revelations there, and not in 622 when he moved from Mecca up to Medina.
And you know what's so significant about Patricia Caroni's comment? She said that no source prior to the Quran makes any mention of Mecca. Well, logic will say, if Mecca didn't even appear until later time, what does that say about the origin of the Quran itself?
Bingo. There we're going to go. Now, the next step, what I want to do, I want to continue with this theme. I'm going to move into this. I'm going to talk about what Shoemaker then comes to his conclusions on this, but also talk about what we now know about Mecca. Some of the things that you and I have talked about. Shoemaker is agreeing with us. He's supporting us completely. Amazing what he comes up with, but that's for the next episode.
Wonderful, brother. So exciting. And I hope everybody is benefiting from this. And I can speak on behalf of Dr. J. We encourage you not only to watch it, but take the material. Take the material and use it in your own outreach, use it in your own debates, use it in your own apologetics, use it in your own evangelism, and also bring in awareness not just to the church, but to our Muslim friends. I'm sure many of you have Muslims in your own network that you can reach out to them in a far better way than we can connect with them. We only speak to them through the screen. You can speak to them face to face. We're doing this for their sake. We want them to find the true path to heaven, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ, and that's our invitation to them. Thank you, brother, as always. Thank you, everyone, for watching. This is Al Fadi, over and out. God bless. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, Sira International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.